Hi all, I'd like to do a video today on the dynamic Benoni system. So the Benoni is a system against d4. When you play against d4, you can either try and classically occupy the centre, say with d5, and it's a bit stodgy, this is the Queen's Gambit declined, or you can play like the Slav defence, or if you really want to play in a more entertaining, dynamic, aggressive way, you could play knight f6, and after c4 you can actually play the move c5, and this leads to the Benoni systems. So basically with c5 you're really provoking the white pawn to go forward, and in doing so, white is weakening these dark squares, so that's potentially useful. If you later fianchetto your bishop, you're gaining a very nice bishop sometimes. But not only that, when white moves the pawn to d5, it means that you can later undermine potentially with b5, or prepare it with a6 and b5, and this pawn will become a target, especially if you get a bishop to b7. So there's all sorts of these ideas which all stem from this provocation move, this c5. And the modern Benoni used to be really popular. Let's have a look at that first. The modern Benoni, where black plays e6 now, and after knight c3, ed, cd. And you may be thinking, why isn't this popular nowadays? Well, it was popular, and even Fischer used it in the World Championship match of 1972, successfully against Spassky. He produced a very dynamic game, accepting double pawns later on the king side. Structurally, what's happened here is that the white pawn has gone from the queen side to the centre. So white, after d6, e4, white potentially, later has f4 and e5, kind of swamping black. But not only that, white, has this d6 target, which can be later probed, with moves like bishop f4, and if white, often gangs up on that d6 with manoeuvres like, knight f3 to d2 to c4. So black structurally has got this, measly d6 pawn and tries to hold up, f4, e5, which could be a thematic break in the position. But, black does have some, dark square counterplay. If he can clamp down on the dark squares, later fianchetto his bishop, and potentially he's also got a queenside pawn majority, 3 pawns here against the 2 pawns. So if black can arrange counterplay later with a6 and b5, that's good. But the situation got worse when there was a key game where John Nunn had just written a book on the modern Benoni, and he'd been blasted by Garry Kasparov using, I believe, the dangerous Taimanov system. So basically, Kasparov played, let's go back. So e4, d6, g6, f4. Very aggressive move immediately, trying to swamp black in the centre. And now this bishop b5 check. And there's a load of theory if black plays either knight d7 or bishop d7. Basically, white's kind of winning a piece in some of these variations, and there's just tons of variations to consider. But so the move which John Nunn played was knight fd7, and I have video annotated that game. If you look for Kasparov and Nunn in your search keywords, you can see what happened in that game. But basically, Kasparov, when he castled queenside, later, kingside, he later played bishop takes d7 and f5 and bishop f4, and it was quite nasty for John Nunn. But after that game, basically, the popularity of the Benoni system as a whole went down considerably. But there are other ways of playing the dynamic Benoni. If we go back, let's have a look at other ways. So that's the modern Benoni, which basically became far less popular after that key encounter between Kasparov playing white and John Nunn playing black. But the Czech Benoni, so basically the Czech Benoni, d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, and now if black plays e5, so that's an interesting way of playing the position. So with that, black's going to later play a d6 move. So say, let's throw in some ideas, bishop e7, and the strategy here for black has got these dark square pawns, and his bishop's hemmed in. So basically, strategically, if he can exchange off this bishop for that bishop later, with say moves like the weird looking knight h7, bishop g5, then he's going to have nice, dark square outposts potentially to aim for. So that's the strategy for black. White, on the other hand, has this biting point, this e5 pawn. So if white can later arrange for f4 in an advantageous way, and black has to play, e takes f, and say bishop takes, black will again, like the modern Benoni, be left with this structural problem, this d6 pawn, which can be later probed. So, but that's the Czech Benoni. So if you like the closed nature of it, and manage to exchange off your dark square bishop, you could get some good results out of that, especially in blitz. The closed Benoni is kind of the same kind of idea, but immediately after d4, so in the closed Benoni, playing immediately c5, so provoking immediately the white pawn to go forward, and now e5. But the difference here is that white hasn't committed that knight to c3 yet. So basically, white can play e4 and can more quickly just play for f4. So this is the closed Benoni. So you have to be careful that white's just not going to play f4 and get nasty pressure on your d6 vulnerability. So without having to commit the knight can go to c3, without having to play c4. So if white hasn't played c4, there's less counterplay with a6 and b5. There's nothing to undermine. There's no pawn on c4. So that's an interesting way of playing the closed Benoni. Just surprising the opponent with immediately challenging their pawn. If white takes, that's no good really, because as well as being able to regain the pawn immediately, it's just white's lost a bit of control of the centre. It's not that great. So provoking the pawn forward is interesting. That's the closed Benoni. Now, even more interesting than all this, there's actually a very powerful gambit, which is one of the most credible gambits of all the gambits. So d4 knight f6, c4 c5 d5, and using that other idea I mentioned about undermining these pawns with b5, b5 can be played immediately. And there's some controversy over the name of this gambit, if it's to be called the Volga gambit over a river, named after a river, or after Paul Benko, who was a very strong US player who played it a lot in his games. So I don't know, let's call it the Benko gambit. So b5. So basically, black is potentially getting a lot of counterplay after c takes a6, and if white accepts this pawn, bishop takes a6, and there's tons of theory again in this. So the Benko gambit, though, is one of the long established gambits, which is known to give black a lot of queenside counterplay, first of all, in that semi-open b file, and also the bishop, when it fianchettos again, it's got nice targets, and white's pawn on d5 can be held up. So the Benko gambit offers tons of counterplay, and is a great opening in its own right. So it stems from that initial Benoni style provocation, this c5, provoking that white pawn forward. Let's also now look at the Blumenfeld gambit. So basically the Blumenfeld is for example d4 knight f6, c4, and not c5 immediately. So e6, and here white plays knight f3, then c5 d6, sorry, c5 d5, move b5, and after takes here, black's compensation is slightly different now after d5. Black's got this nice pawn centre, and there was a classic game of Alekhine where he won on the black side. So black's aiming for different compensation here, just more central control and use of this semi-open f file potentially later. So that's the Blumenfeld gambit, which is again a very aggressive system. So there's different types of compensation from the Benko gambit. Let's now look at the Schmidt Benoni. So d4 knight f6, knight f3, c5, d5, g6. So the Smith Benoni, how does this differ from everything else? Knight c3, bishop g7, e4. So this is a bit of a relative of the Perk defense. If you know your Perk defense theory, which by the way John Nunn did as well, you know, he knew the Perk inside out. So you know, white has slightly different opportunities here because he doesn't have that pawn on c4. It makes a big difference in the position. So the Smith Benoni, which can transpose into a lot of lines in the Perk. There's a Benoni King's Indian hybrid system, which you could refer as a hybrid system, which is basically a cross between a King's Indian and Benoni, when after d5 and black plays d6, and now you know you're playing for g6 and bishop g7, so that's kind of crossing the King's Indian with the Benoni. The snake variation now, so that's d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6, knight c3, so you take on d5, and then you use that d6 square not for a pawn but for your bishop. You play bishop d6, and some of the strategic ideas of this is that, you know, later you can castle and use this e-file and maybe, you know, move this bishop back and take on c3, just weakening white c4, or bishop e5 takes c3. So the snake can be quite dangerous. So that bishop just coming to d6, and so you're delaying, you know, you're putting that as an option to play d6 later when it's more favourable. So that's very interesting. There's also another one, a very nice nicknamed opening called the vulture. So the vulture, d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, now knight e4, so the knight swoops down like a vulture, and so if knight c3 you can just double white's pawns, but otherwise if it's kicked then here knight d6, and you know, this looks as though, you know, what's black going to do against e5? Well, certainly not f6, but you can play here knight a6, and if white continues, then, you know, the knight can come out, you know, to d4, and white's been over-provoked with his pawns. These pawns can't go backwards. So the vulture is an interesting variation in itself. So f3 is not particularly hot. But also, you can just play queen a5 here. I think actually queen a5 is according to Ribka, marginally stronger than knight d6. So after knight d2, now you can play knight d6. You don't really want to take on d2 because then the bishop can come to c3 later. And in this position, like g6. So this makes it kind of awkward if white's knight's on d2. So there's plenty to be thinking about there in the Benoni variations. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.